The turmoil of the 1910s led into perhaps one of the most surprising eras of American history, Prohibition. Surprising not only that it happened, but also for the perfect storm that allowed it to happen. Anti-German sentiment combined with the women's suffrage movement provided the perfect opportunity for moralists to finally take down one of society's great social ills, alcohol. In the process, predominantly German breweries were stretched to the brink of extinction. Without the sale of beer or liquor, these breweries would need to adapt or die. To better understand how this could happen, we have to understand one of the major drivers of change in history: war. Starting in 1914, World War I dominated the consciences of Americans. At first, the fight over whether to stay isolationist, then as a major part of the Allied powers. The war provided the perfect storm for the temperance movement. Throughout the 1800s and the early 1900s, Europeans immigrated to the United States, escaping war, persecution, and looking for a land of opportunity. German settlers made up a large part of this group. A large percentage of German settlers found their way to the upper Midwest, in what is today Minnesota and Wisconsin. These settlers established churches and schools and created communities that were strongly German in culture. Many bought land and farmed, while others made the German drink of choice, beer. Pabst, Miller, Blotz, Schlitz, and so many more Wisconsin brewers established Milwaukee as a leader in brewing. Almost overnight, the American entry into World War I in 1917 turned sentiment against German Americans. Paranoia of German sympathies and the need to support the war effort on the home front brought German breweries into the crosshairs. The economics of the war went against beer making. The need for wheat to feed the soldiers was high. Why waste valuable wheat on making beer? Breweries were criticized for not being loyal by using valuable wheat instead of supporting the war effort through their factories. This missed one important fact. The vats at these breweries were designed to do one thing: make beer. The need for wheat during the war wasn't the only thing putting pressure on beer makers. German American breweries faced intense anti-German sentiment. German Americans in Wisconsin were viewed as a constant threat. Would they be loyal Americans or side with the Kaiser? Many still had family in Germany. Laws like the Espionage Act made it very difficult to dissent against the war, regardless of people's heritage. The act allowed the government to censor opposition to the war and punish those who spoke out against American involvement. Wariness of German Americans led to countless acts of discrimination against those with German heritage, who had little choice but to fully support the war or face retribution. This backdrop allowed for the temperance movement to gain significant traction. Already in 1912, the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association and the Women's Christian Temperance Union teamed up to force a referendum in Wisconsin for women's suffrage. The movement failed, largely due to a disapproval from German brewers and Catholic and Lutheran clergy. Brewers felt the suffrage movement was just a veil for the temperance movement, and clergy feared women stepping out of their defined domestic role in the household. The suffrage and temperance movement were inevitably intertwined. Women had much to gain from Prohibition, as they often faced the consequences of alcohol and its abuses among men. That it's no surprise that both the suffrage and the temperance movement were predominantly women's movements. As factories called more and more women into factory work as the men marched off to war, the stars all aligned. The anti-German American sentiment and the expansion of women's roles during the war gave the suffrage and temperance movements the support they needed to finally gain traction. The war pushed the temperance movement into action. Alcohol production wasted grains and inevitably decreased the effectiveness of factory workers and soldiers on consumption. Already in the summer of 1917, wartime laws supported the rise, forbidding the sale of liquor to the armed forces and not allowing foodstuffs to be used in the making of alcohol. When the Prohibition Amendment resolution passed Congress on December 22, 1917, Miller Brewing employee B.C. Hoppy took the proposed amendment as a deliberate attack against Wisconsin alone. Thousands would lose their jobs. Any dissent would be swiftly labeled as pro-German and anti-war. Wisconsin businessman and politician John Strange made the connection clear that the United States had German enemies, and this country too. And the worst of all are German enemies. The most treacherous, the most menacing, are Pabst, Schlitz, Blotz, and Miller. The 1915 purchase by brewery owners of the Washington Times newspaper was quickly spun in 1918 into a sinister plot all along to spread pro-German propaganda. The tide was turning toward Prohibition, and on January 17, 1919, it was ratified as the 18th Amendment. By the following August of 1920, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. The war opened up opportunities for the temperance movement to capitalize on the anti-German sentiment and the increasing roles of women, bringing America into what would be a very peculiar time in history. Most breweries would go out of business and never reopen again, but some managed to pivot their business models, making soda, chewing gum, chocolate, cheese products, what was known as near beer, a very low alcohol beer that was below the legal limit. One Milwaukee brewery even made snowplows to survive. Finally, the Volstead Act of 1927 provided some relief, allowing the brewing of 2.75% alcohol beer. By 1929, Wisconsin repealed its prohibition enforcement laws. The federal government followed by repealing the Prohibition Amendment in 1933 by passing the 21st Amendment. The failed experiment of prohibition came out of a unique era of converging political goals and ideals in the women's movement and the temperance movement. One lasted and has greatly expanded women's roles and rights as citizens, while the other will go down in infamy. Both likely would have faced significant headwinds if not for a regional conflict breaking out into a global war. Sadly, Wisconsin breweries fell victim to the fear and paranoia of anti-German sentiment, leaving only a few remaining after the dust settled in the fight for a new, sober reality. After a decade of crime, bootlegging, and underground alcohol consumption, it was time to admit that the experiment of prohibition had failed. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and the like if you like this video. If you have any questions about the video, please leave a comment for me below. If you have any suggestions for any other topics you would like me to cover, please leave a comment below and I will look into covering that topic as well. Thank you so much for stopping in once again, and I'll see you next time.